The challenge hall had fallen silent the moment Lord Crispin Ashworth declared that a mere human had no right to stand among those born to immortality. Rosalind Vale had been prepared for skepticism, perhaps even subtle disdain. She had spent months studying vampire law, ancient diplomatic protocols, and the delicate balance between human cities and the hidden courts beneath them. The diplomatic post she sought was unprecedented, a human liaison to serve directly within the Undervault Council, translating between two worlds that had existed in careful separation for centuries. Only 3 candidates remained after months of rigorous examination, and she was the only mortal among them, but she had not been prepared for public humiliation. Crispin stood before the assembled judges and courtiers in the mountaintop chateau, his white hair gleaming under crystal chandeliers, his pale features arranged in an expression of polite contempt. His family had produced diplomats for 6 generations. He wore his heritage like armor. "I mean no disrespect to the human educational system," he said, his voice carrying through the vaulted chamber with practiced ease. "But this position demands not merely knowledge, but an understanding that comes from centuries of lived experience. It requires someone who comprehends the weight of immortal consequence, who feels the pull of blood law in their very veins. Miss Vale is doubtless accomplished within her own limited sphere, but she is fundamentally unworthy of standing beside those of us who carry the burden of eternity." Rosalind felt her face burn. Around the hall, vampire courtiers exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable. Others nodded slightly, as though Crispin had merely voiced what they had all been thinking. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself with the careful arguments she had rehearsed, to cite her academic achievements and her years working in human-vampire relations. But before she could speak, a crystal glass touched down on marble with a sound like a bell. Everyone turned. Theron Dravos had been seated at the high table with the other judges, positioned to remain neutral throughout the selection process. He was the vampire king of the northern reaches, ancient beyond measure, and his presence at the trials had been both honor and formality. He rarely spoke during the proceedings, offering only brief questions during examinations, his pale eyes assessing each candidate with an intensity that made even other vampires nervous. Now he stood, unfolding to his full height with the unhurried grace of someone who had never needed to rush toward anything in his long existence. "Lord Ashworth," he said quietly. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the chamber like a blade through silk. "You will retract that statement." Crispin's confident expression faltered. "Your Majesty, I only meant—" "I know what you meant." Theron descended from the judge's dais, each step measured and deliberate. He was dressed simply compared to the ornate courtiers around them, all in black save for a single silver pin at his collar marking his rank. His white hair was pulled back severely, emphasizing the sharp planes of his face and the absolute stillness with which he held himself. "You meant to dismiss an opponent you fear you cannot defeat on merit alone. You meant to invoke blood privilege because you lack the confidence to stand on your own achievements. Such tactics are beneath this court." The silence that followed was suffocating. Crispin's pale face went even whiter, if such a thing were possible. "I have every confidence in my own abilities. Then prove it through the trials, as she has done." Theron stopped 3 paces from Crispin, and though he did not raise his voice or make any threatening gesture, every person in the room could feel the weight of his authority. "Miss Vale has scored highest in diplomatic theory, demonstrated fluency in 4 vampire dialects, including Old Tongue, and provided the only viable solution to the Blackwater trade dispute in our written examinations. If you wish to question her worthiness, perhaps you should first question why your own scores fall below hers." Rosalind's breath caught. She had not known the rankings were being shared. Crispin's jaw tightened. Around them, courtiers shifted, suddenly very interested in the marble floor. "Your Majesty," Crispin said stiffly, "I accept your correction." It was not quite an apology, but Theron merely inclined his head and returned to the judges' table without another word. The head examiner cleared her throat and called for a recess, and the assembled crowd dispersed into murmuring clusters. Rosalind stood frozen for a moment, her heart hammering. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the corridor that led to the candidate quarters, needing air, needing space, needing to think. She had made it halfway down the torch-lit hallway when she heard footsteps behind her, vampire quiet, barely a whisper of sound. "Miss Vale," She turned to find Theron Dravos standing 10 feet away, his pale eyes fixed on her face. Thank you, she said, because it seemed the only thing to say. You didn't have to. I did. He moved closer, though he maintained a careful distance, as though aware that his presence might be overwhelming in the narrow corridor. Crispin's statement was not merely rude. It was a violation of the trial's founding principle that merit, not birth, determines worth in service. If such attitudes are allowed to flourish unchecked, this entire process becomes a farce. Rosalind studied him. Up close, he was even more striking than he appeared from a distance, not beautiful in any soft sense, but compelling in the way a winter storm was compelling. Dangerous and cold and impossible to look away from. Still, she said carefully, your defense may be seen as favoritism. It might undermine my legitimacy if I win. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or approval. You're thinking like a diplomat already. I'm thinking like someone who has fought for every opportunity she's ever had, Rosalind corrected. I can't afford to have my achievements questioned because a king defended me. Would you rather I had remained silent? I don't know, she admitted. The honesty felt dangerous, but she was tired of being careful. I'm grateful, but I'm also aware that I just made an enemy of one of the most influential courtiers in the undervault, and now everyone will be watching to see if you show me preferential treatment. Theron regarded her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but close. Then I will be careful not to, he said quietly, and he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the corridor with the scent of old stone and burning torches. The trials continued over the following weeks with renewed intensity. The three remaining candidates, Rosalind, Crispin, and a sharp-minded vampire named Seraphine, were put through increasingly complex scenarios designed to test their diplomatic instincts, their knowledge of both cultures, and their ability to navigate impossible situations. They negotiated mock trade disputes, they drafted peace treaties, they were thrown into rooms with actors playing hostile human politicians and suspicious vampire elders, forced to build bridges across centuries of mistrust. Rosalind threw herself into the work with single-minded focus. She studied until her eyes burned and her head ached. She practiced Old Tongue pronunciation until she dreamed in it. She memorized the lineages of every major vampire house and the voting patterns of every human parliament member who dealt with undervault affairs, and she pretended not to notice the way Theron Dravos watched her. He never showed favoritism during the trials themselves. His questions to her were as sharp and probing as those he directed at the other candidates. He gave no indication that he saw her as anything other than another competitor to be assessed, but there were small things. Once she stayed late in the chateau's library, poring over historical records of past diplomatic failures, trying to understand the patterns of breakdown. She worked until the candles burned low and the fire in the hearth dwindled to embers. When she finally looked up, blinking tired eyes, she found that someone had relit the lamp on her desk, the good one, with the clear glass that gave the brightest light. She had been so absorbed she had not heard anyone enter. Another time, the chateau kitchens served a formal dinner for candidates and judges alike. The menu was entirely vampire cuisine, raw delicacies, and blood wines that most humans found unsettling at best. Rosalind had steeled herself to eat politely, to show no discomfort. But when the plates were served, she found hers held the one dish she could actually enjoy, a preparation of seared meat and roasted vegetables that would not have been out of place in a human household. No explanation was offered, no attention was drawn. But when she glanced up, she caught Theron's pale eyes on her for just a moment before he looked away. These things could have been coincidence, probably were coincidence, but she found herself thinking about him anyway, in the quiet hours between studying and sleep. Found herself aware of exactly where he was in any room they shared. Found herself reading more into his brief, grave words than was likely wise. She told herself it was foolish. He was a king, ancient and powerful, and she was a human woman who would age and die in what was, to him, the blink of an eye. Even if he felt some sort of interest which was far from certain, there could be no future in it. So she focused on the trials and tried to ignore the way her pulse quickened when he entered a room. The turning point came during the penultimate trial, a complex negotiation exercise conducted before the full assembly of judges and courtiers. The scenario was brutal. A human city wanted to expand its subway system, but the proposed route would cut through part of the Undervault's protected territory. The vampire court refused to allow construction. Tensions were escalating. Both sides had valid concerns and no obvious compromise. Each candidate was given 2 hours to propose a solution and defend it before hostile questioning. Seraphine went first and suggested a compensation package, human investment in Undervault infrastructure in exchange for limited access. It was a solid approach, though the vampire judges pointed out that it did not address the core territorial concern. Crispin proposed rerouting the subway line entirely, keeping it within human-controlled areas. The human judges immediately objected that this would increase costs exponentially and delay the project by years. Then, it was Rosalind's turn. She stood before the assembly, feeling the weight of dozens of immortal eyes upon her, and laid out her proposal, a joint sovereignty zone. The subway would be built, but the section running through disputed territory would be co-governed by a human vampire commission. Both sides would benefit from the infrastructure. Both sides would have oversight. It would require trust and cooperation, but it would also create a model for future collaboration. "You are suggesting we share governance of our own territory?" one of the vampire elders asked sharply. I'm suggesting we redefine what we mean by territory," Rosalind replied. "The old model treats human and vampire spaces as separate kingdoms with hard borders. But our worlds are more interconnected than that now. Humans live above Undervault holdings. Vampires move through human cities. We already share space, we just don't share power. If we want lasting peace, that has to change." The questions came hard and fast after that. She defended her proposal against accusations of naivety, challenges to its feasibility, and concerns about precedent. She held her ground, citing historical examples, pointing out similar arrangements in other contexts, acknowledging risks while emphasizing potential benefits. When she finally finished, her throat was dry and her hands were trembling slightly from adrenaline, but she had answered every question put to her. The head examiner nodded. "Thank you, Miss Vale. We will convene to discuss a moment." Crispin stood, his expression smooth and sympathetic in a way that immediately put Rosalind on edge. "I feel I must raise a concern. Miss Vale's proposal is certainly creative, and her performance today has been admirable. But I wonder if we can truly evaluate her work as impartial when she has enjoyed such obvious support from the high table." The room went very still. "Explain yourself, Lord Ashworth," the head examiner said carefully. Crispin spread his hands in a gesture of reluctance. "I raise this only out of respect for the integrity of these trials, but it has not escaped notice that His Majesty has shown particular interest in Miss Vale's comfort and success. The relit lamp when she studies late, the modified menu at dinner, his defense of her before the trials even began. I do not suggest anything improper," he added quickly. "Only that such attention creates an appearance of favoritism that undermines the process. How can we judge whether she has truly earned this position or whether she has simply benefited from royal patronage?" Rosalind felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Around the room, courtiers murmured. Several judges exchanged troubled glances. Because Crispin was right not about her merit, but about the appearance. She had noticed those small gestures from Theron. Others had clearly noticed them too, and now her entire candidacy was tainted by association. She looked toward the judges' table, toward Theron. He sat perfectly still, his pale face expressionless, his eyes unreadable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood. "Lord Ashworth raises a valid concern," he said quietly, and Rosalind felt something crack in her chest. "The integrity of these trials must be beyond question. To ensure that no candidate is advantaged or disadvantaged by perceived judicial favoritism, I will recuse myself from the remainder of the selection process. My vote will be surrendered, and the decision will rest with the other judges alone." He inclined his head to the head examiner, then turned and walked from the hall without looking at Rosalind once. The silence he left behind was deafening. Rosalind stood frozen as the examiner called an end to the day's proceedings. Courtiers filed out, some casting sympathetic glances her way, others smirking. Crispin looked supremely satisfied. She had just lost her only open supporter on the judging panel, and everyone in the undervault now believed there might be something improper between her and the king. Worse, far worse, she could not tell if Theron's withdrawal was a cold political calculation or a personal rejection. He had not defended her this time, had not argued against Crispin's implications, had simply stepped back and left her to sink or swim on her own. She should be angry, she thought distantly, should be furious at the way he had exposed her to this scrutiny with his small kindnesses, then abandoned her to face the consequences alone. Instead, she felt hollowed out and aching in a way she did not want to examine too closely. The final trial took place 3 days later. In those 3 days, Rosalind saw Theron exactly once, passing in a corridor. He nodded to her with the same grave courtesy he showed everyone and continued walking. No private words, no explanation, nothing. She told herself it did not matter. She had come here to win a position through her own merit, not to pursue an impossible attraction to an immortal king. His distance was appropriate, professional, exactly what the situation required. It still felt like a knife between her ribs every time she thought about it. The final trial was the most challenging yet, a live negotiation with actual stakes. A real dispute had arisen between a human merchant collective and a vampire trading house over contract terms. The candidates would each attempt to mediate, and the parties involved would choose which solution they preferred. That choice would carry significant weight in the final decision. Rosalind went last, after watching Seraphine and Crispin each make their attempts. Both had done well. Seraphine had been creative. Crispin had been thorough. When Rosalind's turn came, she sat down with the human merchants and vampire traders and listened. She asked questions. She drew out the underlying concerns beneath the surface positions. And slowly, carefully, she built a framework that gave both sides what they actually needed rather than what they claimed to want. It took 4 hours. By the end, her back ached from sitting and her voice was hoarse. But when she finally shook hands with both parties, she knew she had done the best work of her life. The merchants and traders withdrew to deliberate. The candidates were sent to wait in separate chambers. Rosalind sat alone in a small room with a single window overlooking the mountain valley below. Evening was falling, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and tried not to think about what came next. A soft knock at the door made her turn. Theron stood in the doorway, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "You should not be here," Rosalind said quietly. "If someone sees—" "I no longer have a vote to compromise," he replied, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "And I find I do not particularly care what anyone sees." He moved to stand beside the window, close enough that she could feel the coolness that radiated from his skin, far enough that they were not quite touching. "I owe you an explanation," he said, staring out at the darkening valley, "for my withdrawal." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, rougher. "Crispin was correct. I had shown you favoritism. Not in the trials themselves. Every question I asked you, every score I gave was honest assessment, but outside them, I noticed you. I found myself wanting to ease your path. Small things, but enough to create perception of impropriety." "Why?" The question escaped before Rosalind could stop it. Theron turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his pale eyes stole her breath. "Because when you argued for joint sovereignty, you were not trying to appease both sides. You were trying to build something new. Because you study past failures not to assign blame, but to understand patterns. Because when Crispin called you unworthy, you did not shrink. You burned, quiet and fierce, and all I could think was that he was the unworthy one, for failing to see what stood before him." Rosalind's heart hammered against her ribs. "You stepped back." "I had to." His hands tightened on the windowsill. "If I had remained, your victory would always be questioned. You would have won this position, I have no doubt of that. But there would always be whispers that you earned it through my favor rather than your own merit. I could not let that happen. You deserved better. So you made it look like you agreed with Crispin's accusations, like you thought there might be something improper to hide." "Yes." The word was clipped, almost bitter. "I have led courts and waged wars and negotiated peace across centuries. I am not accustomed to helplessness, but in this, there was no path that did not cost you something. I chose the path that would cost you the least in the long term, even if it hurt you in the moment. Rosalind absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. You protected me by leaving. I tried to. She studied his profile, the sharp lines of his face, the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself apart even now, as though afraid that coming closer would damage her further. And suddenly, she understood. He had not withdrawn because he did not care. He had withdrawn because he cared too much, and he had chosen her future over his own feelings. It was possibly the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her, and it had felt like abandonment. I thought you had decided I was not worth the trouble, she admitted. His head snapped toward her. Never. The word was fierce, almost angry, and it unlocked something in Rosalind's chest that she had been holding tight and protected. I'm going to win this, she said quietly. I'm going to win it fairly, on my own merit, and no one will be able to question it. I know. And then you and I are going to have a longer conversation about this. Something flickered in his eyes, hope, fragile and uncertain. Are we? We are, Rosalind confirmed. She turned back to the window, standing close enough now that their shoulders almost brushed. Because I notice you too. I think about you too. And if I'm going to serve as a bridge between our worlds, I would very much like to understand what it means to care for someone who exists outside the normal bounds of time. Theron was quiet for a long moment. Then, very carefully, as though handling something precious, he reached out and took her hand. His skin was cool, his grip gentle but unshakable. They stood together in the gathering dark, not speaking, just being present with each other in a way they had not allowed themselves before. A bell chimed in the distance, signaling that the final deliberations were complete. Theron released her hand and stepped back. Go, he said softly. Finish this. Rosalind nodded and walked to the door. She paused on the threshold and looked back. He stood by the window, straight and proud, and watching her with an expression that made her feel like the most important person in any world, mortal or otherwise. She went to receive the judgment. The announcement took place in the same great hall where Crispin had first called her unworthy. The human merchants and vampire traders stood before the assembly and explained their choice. They had appreciated all three candidates' efforts. Seraphine had been insightful. Crispin had been detail-oriented. But Rosalind Vale had understood not just the technical aspects of their dispute, but the human element, and she had crafted a solution that actually addressed their real concerns rather than their stated positions. They chose her mediation as the most effective. The head examiner rose and announced the judge's final decision. The vote had been unanimous among the remaining panel. Rosalind Vale was selected as the first human liaison to the Undervault Council. The hall erupted in applause, not universal, but substantial. Even some of those who had been skeptical seemed willing to acknowledge merit when they saw it demonstrated. Crispin looked sour, but managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement. Seraphine approached and clasped Rosalind's hand, offering genuine congratulations. And at the back of the hall, standing where he had no vote and no official role, Theron Dravos watched with an expression of quiet pride. The formal installation ceremony took place a week later, after Rosalind had been briefed on her duties and introduced to the Undervault Council members she would be working with. The ceremony itself was held in the ancient chamber beneath the mountain where the council convened, a vast space carved from living rock, lit by thousands of candles and hung with banners representing the great vampire houses. Rosalind wore formal dress that bridged both cultures, a gown of deep burgundy with human-style draping and vampire-style metalwork embroidery. Her dark hair was pinned up, revealing the line of her neck, a gesture of trust in this gathering of predators. She stood before the council and spoke the oath of service, promising to serve as honest bridge and faithful translator between the human world and the immortal courts. Her voice rang clear through the chamber, steady and sure. When she finished, the head of the council stood to formally acknowledge her appointment. But before she could speak, Theron rose from his seat at the neutral observation table, the place reserved for monarchs who attended council proceedings but held no vote in its deliberations. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. I wish to cede my seat, he said clearly. Silence fell. Your Majesty, the council head asked carefully. The neutral table is reserved for— I am aware of its purpose, Theron interrupted gently. It is meant for those who observe but do not participate, for those who remain separate from the council's work. I no longer wish to remain separate. He stepped down from the neutral table and walked across the chamber floor to where Rosalind stood. He moved with that same unhurried grace, but there was something different in his bearing now, something decided and final. He stopped beside her and turned to face the council. I wish to take a seat at the working table, he said, as Rosalind Vale's partner in the work of building bridges between our peoples. Not as king imposing judgment, but as equal joining in service. The implications rippled through the chamber like a stone dropped in still water. A monarch did not serve on council. A king did not position himself as equal to a liaison, unless that king was declaring something far more personal than political alliance. The council head stared at him. Your Majesty, such a position would require you to give up certain neutralities, certain distances. It would tie you to the council's work in ways that might limit your sovereignty. I understand, Theron said calmly. I am willing to accept those limitations. His pale eyes met Rosalind's, and there was no distance in them now, no careful neutrality, just steady, certain regard. If the liaison will have me, he added quietly. Rosalind's throat tightened with emotion. He was not just offering to work alongside her, he was publicly declaring his choice to stand with her as partner rather than judge. He was sacrificing political separation for personal connection. He was choosing her openly before all the courts and councils. Yes, she said, her voice rough but clear. I will have you. Something warm and almost vulnerable crossed his severe features, not quite a smile, but close. The council head looked between them for a long moment. Then, perhaps reading the futility of argument or perhaps genuinely moved by the gesture, she inclined her head. Then let it be recorded, she said. Theron Dravos, king of the northern reaches, takes seat at the council table as partner to Liaison Vale. May they serve with wisdom and build bridges that last. The chamber erupted in murmurs, shock and approval and speculation all mixed together. But Rosalind barely heard it. She was too focused on Theron, standing beside her now in a way he had not allowed himself to stand before. Equal, partner, hers. The ceremony concluded with the traditional pledges from various vampire houses to support the liaison's work. Through it all, Theron remained at Rosalind's side, a silent but unshakable presence. When the formal proceedings finally ended and the chamber began to empty, he turned to her. Walk with me? She nodded, and together they left the council chamber, making their way through the undervault's winding passages until they emerged onto a high terrace overlooking the mountain valley. Night had fallen, and the stars were brilliant overhead. You gave up your neutral seat, Rosalind said quietly, leaning against the terrace wall. That was a significant sacrifice. It was a choice I should have made weeks ago, Theron replied, standing close enough that she could feel the coolness radiating from him. I have spent centuries holding myself apart, believing that distance equated to fairness, that neutrality equated to wisdom. But distance can also be cowardice, and I find I am tired of being wise if it means being alone. Rosalind turned to face him fully. What are you saying? He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and traced the line of her jaw with cool fingers. I'm saying that I did not defend you before the court because of some abstract principle, he said quietly. I defended you because the thought of you being hurt or diminished was intolerable. I withdrew from judging not because I questioned your merit, but because I knew I could no longer be objective where you were concerned. And I took a council seat not because I have any particular desire to attend endless committee meetings, but because I wanted to be wherever you are. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and his voice dropped lower. I am saying that I have lived a very long time, Rosalind Vale, and I have never met anyone who made me want to surrender distance and neutrality and wise, lonely separation. Not until you walked into that hall and burned quiet and fierce in the face of someone who tried to diminish you. Rosalind's breath caught. I'm human. I'm going to age and die in what is, to you, an eye blink. I am aware, and that doesn't trouble you? It troubles me deeply, Theron admitted. The thought of losing you troubles me. The thought of watching you fade while I remain unchanged troubles me. But the thought of not having whatever time we might share troubles me more. He paused, and something vulnerable crossed his face. There is another option, he said carefully. One I will only raise once and never pressure you toward. Vampires can turn humans. It is neither easy nor simple, and it is a choice that cannot be unmade. But it is possible. If you ever wish to share immortality rather than a human lifespan, I would offer it. Not now, you have just begun your work, and such a choice should never be made hastily. But someday, if you chose it freely, I would count it an honor to be the one who transformed you. Rosalind stared at him, absorbing the weight of what he was offering. Not just love, but eternity. Not just partnership, but the chance to stand truly equal, immortal beside immortal. It should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. It was also thrilling in a way that made her feel reckless and brave. Ask me again in a year, she said softly. After I've proven myself in this position, after I've had time to understand what I would be choosing. And if I still feel the way I feel right now when I look at you. Ask me then. And how do you feel right now? His voice was barely a whisper, his pale eyes searching hers. Rosalind rose up on her toes and kissed him. His lips were cool and gentle, and for a heartbeat he held perfectly still, as though afraid of breaking something precious. Then his arms came around her, sure and strong, and he kissed her back with a fierceness that belied his usual careful control. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than necessary, Rosalind rested her forehead against his. I feel like I found something I did not know I was looking for, she whispered. I feel like I want to build a life that bridges worlds with you beside me. I feel like unworthy is the last word anyone could use to describe this. Theron's arms tightened around her. You were never unworthy, not for a moment, not in any way. I know that now. She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. You helped me know that. They stood together on the terrace, wrapped in each other in the mountain night, and it felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The year that followed was perhaps the busiest and most fulfilling of Rosalind's life. She threw herself into her work as liaison, mediating disputes, facilitating communication, slowly building trust between communities that had existed in careful separation for generations. It was frustrating and exhausting and occasionally heartbreaking work. There were failures and setbacks and moments when she wanted to scream at the sheer stubborn stupidity of both vampires and humans who refused to see past their own prejudices. But there were also victories. Small at first, a trade agreement here, a shared cultural event there. Then larger. A joint task force to address mutual security concerns, a student exchange program, a revised treaty that gave both sides more flexibility while maintaining essential protections. And through it all, Theron was beside her. Not hovering or protecting or speaking for her. He had meant what he said about being partner rather than king in this context. But present, steady, offering quiet support and occasionally devastating insight when complex problems seemed unsolvable. They worked together during the day and stole time together at night. They walked the undervault passages and explored the mountain valleys. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, politics and history and foolish human customs and stranger vampire traditions. They learned each other slowly, carefully, building something solid beneath the initial fierce attraction. Rosalind learned that Theron was shockingly funny in a bone-dry way that caught her off guard, that he loved music but claimed to be terrible at making it, that he had a perfect memory for poetry and would sometimes recite verses in languages so old they made old tongue sound modern. Theron learned that Rosalind had a vicious competitive streak that emerged during strategy games, that she cried easily at beautiful things but held stone-faced through terrible ones, that she talked in her sleep sometimes, murmuring arguments with people who had frustrated her during the day. They fell deeper in love with every passing week. And gradually, as the year drew toward its close, Rosalind found herself certain. The turning ceremony was private, witnessed only by the Undervault Council as tradition required. Rosalind had thought carefully about the choice. She'd consulted with turned vampires about what the transformation entailed. She had discussed it with human friends and vampire colleagues. She had taken every precaution to ensure she was choosing freely, with full understanding of what she would gain and what she would lose. In the end, the choice was simple. She wanted to continue the work she had started, and that work would take centuries. She wanted to stand beside Theron not as a brief, bright flame, but as an equal through time. She wanted eternity with all its challenges and sorrows and strange, endless beauty. The transformation itself was excruciating, 3 days of fever and pain as her body died and reformed into something new. Theron stayed with her through all of it, cool hands soothing her burning skin, quiet voice talking her through the worst moments. When she finally woke on the 4th day, the world had changed. Colors were sharper, sounds were clearer. She could hear heartbeats in distant chambers and smell the particular scent of different types of stone. Her body felt strong and strange and perfect in ways it never had before. And when she looked at Theron, she could see him truly for the first time, not just the surface beauty, but the way he moved through space, the subtle shifts in his expression, the depth of feeling in eyes she had once thought cold. "Hello," he said softly, and she heard layers in his voice she had never caught before. "Hello," she whispered back. Her voice sounded different, too richer, with an echo she would need time to master. He took her hand, threading their fingers together. No difference in temperature now, they were the same, cool and deathless. "How do you feel?" "Strange, powerful, hungry," she paused. "Happy." He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. "Welcome to eternity, Rosalind Vale." She pulled him closer and kissed him properly, fierce and joyful, tasting the promise of endless time. They were married in a ceremony that blended human and vampire traditions, held in the great hall where Crispin had once called her unworthy. Half the guests were mortal, half immortal, and the celebration lasted 3 days and 3 nights. Crispin himself attended, which Rosalind considered gracious of him. He had never apologized directly, but he had worked with her professionally over the past year without incident. During the reception, he approached and offered stiff congratulations. "You have proven yourself an effective liaison," he said formally. "I was wrong to question your qualifications." It was not quite an apology for calling her unworthy, but it was acknowledgement, and she accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Lord Ashworth. I hope we will continue to work well together." He inclined his head and withdrew, and Rosalind turned back to the celebration, to the people from both worlds who had gathered to witness this joining. Theron found her on the terrace again, the same one where they had first kissed a year ago. He slipped an arm around her waist and pulled her close. "Regrets?" he murmured against her hair. "None," she said honestly. "You?" "I regret that I did not defend you sooner, that I let even a moment of doubt or distance come between us." Rosalind twisted to face him. "Your distance protected me. It gave me the space to win on my own terms. I understand that now." Still, he cupped her face in his hands. "I should have found a way to do both, to protect your legitimacy and to let you know beyond doubt that I chose you. I should have been less careful and more brave." "You were brave," Rosalind countered. "It takes courage to step back when every instinct tells you to fight. It takes courage to sacrifice your own feelings for someone else's good. And it took tremendous courage to claim me publicly before the council, knowing what you were giving up." She kissed him softly. "You have always been brave, Theron Dravos. I love you for it." His arms came around her, holding her close, and they stood together watching the stars wheel overhead, the same stars they would watch for centuries to come. "I love you," he said quietly. "I will love you through whatever comes, through political storms and social changes and the turning of ages. Through all of it, I choose you." "And I choose you," Rosalind whispered back. "Every day, every year, every century, I choose you." They returned to the celebration hand in hand, king and liaison, vampire and vampire, partners in work and life and eternity. The music swelled as they entered, and Theron swept her into a dance, the first of countless dances they would share across the ages. Rosalind laughed, pure and joyful, and thought about the moment months ago when she had stood in this hall and heard herself called unworthy. How wrong that judgment had been, how spectacularly, completely wrong. She was not unworthy. She had never been unworthy, and she had proven it through her own merit, her own strength, her own fierce determination to build bridges where others saw only walls. The Vampire King had defended her when she needed defending, but more importantly, he had loved her enough to step back when she needed space. And now he stood beside her as equal and partner in a life they would build together across centuries. She had won her position, she had won her legitimacy, she had won her place in both worlds, and she had won his heart, as he had won hers. That night, after the celebration had finally wound down and the last guests had departed, Rosalind and Theron retreated to the private chambers they now shared in the Undervault's royal wing. The rooms were elegant but comfortable, decorated with pieces from both their lives, her books and his ancient weapons, her artwork and his historical maps. They stood together by the window overlooking the mountain valley, now as familiar to her vampire senses as her own heartbeat had once been. "I cannot promise it will be easy," Theron said quietly, his arms around her from behind. "The work we do will make enemies. Change always does, and eternity is beautiful but also strange and sometimes lonely, even when shared." "I know," Rosalind said. She leaned back against his chest, solid and sure. "I'm not afraid of difficulty. I'm not afraid of enemies. And I'm not afraid of eternity, as long as I face it with you." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "We will build something lasting, not just between our peoples but between us, something that will stand the test of centuries. I believe that absolutely." Theron's severe features softened into an expression of such profound love that it stole her breath even now. "Then we will build it together," he said simply. "Every day, every year, every century, together." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise, and Rosalind kissed him back with all the fierce joy and certainty in her immortal heart. They had time now, all the time in the world. Time to work and build and change both their worlds for the better, time to love and grow and discover each other through endless ages. The rival suitor had called her unworthy, and the Vampire King had defended her. But more than that, more important than that, she had proven her own worth through merit and determination and unwavering commitment to building something better. And in the process, she had won not just a position or a victory, but a love that would last forever. Outside their window, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, a dawn she would never see again now that she was vampire. But she did not mourn the loss. Instead, she marveled at the trade. Sunlight for starlight, brief mortality for endless possibility, a single lifetime for eternity beside the man she loved. It was a fair exchange, more than fair. It was everything she had never known to want, and everything she would spend forever grateful to have found. Theron pulled her toward their bed, and she went willingly, gladly, knowing that this was just the beginning of their story together. The first chapter had been about proving herself worthy, but all the chapters to come would be about building a life and a love that transcended worthiness entirely, that existed simply because they had chosen each other freely and completely and would continue choosing each other through all the ages yet to come. That was the real victory. That was the real prize. Not the position she had won or the legitimacy she had earned, though those mattered, and she was proud of them, but the love she had found and the partner she had gained and the future they would build together across centuries of patient, persistent work and fierce, unwavering devotion. She had been called unworthy once, in a moment meant to break her. Instead, it had led her here to strength and love and eternity. And she would spend that eternity ensuring that no one else was ever made to feel unworthy for daring to reach beyond the boundaries others set for them. That would be her legacy. Their legacy, built together. It was a good way to spend forever.